hiring Aaron Glenn as the head coach after firing Robert Saleh after a 4-year and 20-36 record tenure with the Jets. Aaron Glenn was the Lions defensive coordinator for 4 years, 5th in defensive grade, 11th in EPA per play this last year, despite a ton of injuries on that side of the ball, and also played 8 years for the Jets, was a 2-time Pro Bowler, and he's a member of the Jets' all-time 4-decade team. So a lot like Mike Vrabel, he was a pretty damn good player for the franchise he's now coaching as well. What do you think of this hire for the Jets?
I think this came down to, one, familiarity with the organization, right? Obviously as a player, and you mentioned as a scout. And two, the fact that it just seemed Aaron Glenn really wanted this job, right? There were two guys that Glenn wasn't quite as outwardly vocal about it because the Lions were still in the postseason, but it seemed like the two guys that really wanted this Jets job, which I think is more and more rare as the years go on, were Aaron Glenn and Rex Ryan, and they would have been taking the ultimate wild card swing if they would have gone with Rex Ryan. All due respect to what he did with the Jets the first time around, maybe they just needed someone a little more forward-thinking and in the game right now who hasn't been out of it for 10 years. Now, I think that's a big part of it. I think the fact that Glenn wanted this job and wanted to be a leader in this organization, that's really the issue. Look, is coming out of this season and the way everything's gone with Aaron Rodgers, with Robert Saleh, with Nathaniel Hackett, with Joe Douglas, with everything else, nothing on the field matters, right? This is going to sound funny. They need leadership. They need to figure out who the leadership is. It's Aaron Glenn as the head coach, and I think what I like about this early on is he's really established, and I really like that he hired an experienced defensive coordinator like Steve Wilks. He's going to hand Steve Wilks the keys because Steve Wilks deserves the keys to a defense, right? He's been really good for a long time. Aaron Glenn's going to be the leader of this team. He's going to hold people accountable. And look, is there plenty to figure out on the field? Sure, but before that, it's once again about resetting the culture here, because I think we've had too many coaches lately who just have not been able to do that, right? I think Robert Saleh started to get there, but then the quarterback issues and, benching Zach Wilson and Mike White and that year they had in 2022. And then Aaron Rodgers comes in with Nathaniel Hackett, and it feels like Rodgers is running the team, and there just has been a void in leadership for a long time. If Aaron Glenn can bring that, then the rest of the dominoes on the field fall, and we can talk about those. But that's really what they need, is somebody who wanted this job and someone who wanted to take command of this job.
Yeah, I think just establishing a culture in New York is important. And honestly, he's one of the best culture hires that we have. He was a coach that players loved and respected, and fixing the defense is obviously going to be paramount for him as well. They had the 8th lowest graded defense in 2024, despite having superstars on that side of the ball, right? It's almost inexcusable how bad they were defensively last year. I think Aaron Glenn's going to try to fix that immediately when he's there. Alongside Steve Wilks is the new DC for the Jets, you mentioned before. And then Tanner Engstrand is the new offensive coordinator. He was the Lions passing game coordinator for recently as well. So exciting coordinator hire, I think, in Tanner Engstrand. I think it's a guy who could be a rising star in this sport.
I think so. I think when you talk about being a tight ends coach first under Dan Campbell, who was pretty much the ultimate tight ends coach, that's a good experience to have. He also worked under Jim Harbaugh way back in his days at the University of San Diego, and he was an analyst 1 year for him at Michigan. I'm curious to see. I think Engstrand's the wild card here. I think we really, obviously, he's never called plays before. My guess would be that he wants to emphasize tight ends and the run game and play action in a similar way as Jim Harbaugh, as Ben Johnson, as anybody else he's worked under, in between. I assume he would want balance and he'd want to build this thing. Look, if you're running this offense, you got to build it around Breece Hall and Garrett Wilson. That's just where it's at. Now, the big question is whether Aaron Rodgers and Devontae Adams are there for one more year, and that adds a wrinkle to it. But even if they're not and they're gone, you have Breece Hall, you have Garrett Wilson. Very quietly, you have a pretty good offensive line, actually. You've got Olu Fashanu, you've got Joe Tippmann, you've got Elijah Vera Tucker. John Simpson was really good. Maybe you have to fill in at right tackle if Morgan Moses leaves. But the one thing that I thought they needed to do last offseason that would put them into the playoff race, that just ended up not because everything else fell apart, was fixing their offensive line. That's the one thing they actually did a pretty good job of this year. So I think they have a foundation up front. They have Breece, they have Garrett. We don't know. I don't think Glenn is opposed to Aaron Rodgers for one more year, but they can't wait much longer for him to make that decision, because you have to figure out, let's just say, draft time. We keep talking about, well, who could trade up for a quarterback, for a Shedeur Sanders, a Cam Ward, if the Browns maybe are going to trade down. the Jets are going to be maybe the first team on that list, right? If you're talking about, okay, they need a guy for the future, because otherwise, if Rodgers retires and they don't get that done, you're probably starting Tyrod Taylor this year. And nobody's going to expect you to make the playoffs with Tyrod Taylor as your quarterback. Could he be productive? Sure, but you're threading the needle with how much you need to improve the rest of this team. A defense that went from first in grading in 2023 to 24th this season. So I think that's the first question, obviously, that has to be answered offensively. Is it Aaron Rodgers or is it not? And what are our intentions in the draft?
Yeah, absolutely. And speaking of the draft, they are 11th in draft capital, 5th in offseason assets total. They have about $15.3 million in effective cap space as 20th in the NFL. You mentioned before, they have a rebuilt offensive line to work with, a lot of young stars to work with as well, in Breece Hall, Garrett Wilson, Sauce Gardner, and Quinnen Williams. The big thing is just figure out the plan of quarterback. Is it Aaron Rodgers for another year? Do they trade up to get a Shedeur Sanders or Cam Ward? Do they wait a year with a stopgap like Tyrod Taylor and then hope to get, say, an Arch Manning or somebody else in the 2026 NFL draft? They got to just figure out a plan at quarterback right now. I think that is probably priority number one for New York. But Aaron Glenn, the new New York Jets head coach, former Lions defensive coordinator, Lions losing both coordinators now to head coaching jobs.
Thanks for watching, everybody. Make sure you like and subscribe the video. And if you don't have a PFF Plus subscription, you can get one to see all the premium stats that we talked about here on the show, plus the expert betting and fantasy advice over at subscribe.pff.com. The description is also right below, so if you are not a PFF Plus subscriber, you can become one today.